They made Britain laugh. They wore tuxedos, delivered punchlines, won BAFTAs, and sometimes wore blackface. This isn't about cancellation. It's about memory. About how an entire generation of British icons got away with putting on someone else's skin and calling it entertainment. Some said it was satire. Others said it was tradition. None of them expected the tapes to resurface. 21 old British actors who were secretly racist and broadcast it to millions. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button if you love stories that make you uncomfortable in all the right ways. We've got hours of strange, unsettling history coming your way. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? We want to know which corners of the world are still wide awake, haunted, curious, and maybe just a little too interested in the things people were never supposed to remember. 1. Laurence Olivier. Once hailed as the crown jewel of British theatre, Laurence Olivier wasn't just acting royalty, he was acting monarchy, the kind of man who could smirk with gravitas, slap a soliloquy across the face, and make Hamlet sound like a sermon. And in 1965, he decided to play Othello. Not just play Othello, he became Othello. Right down to the pitch-black skin, prosthetic features, and a voice like gravel soaked in molasses. To some at the time, it was a bold artistic choice. To others, it was a cinematic horror show of racial caricature wrapped in Shakespearean cloth. Olivier not only wore blackface, he designed it, method acted it, and then praised his own decision to do so. The whole point of Othello, he once said, is that he is a black man. Not a Moor, not a general, a black man. And so, in his mind, to act black was to look, sound, and move like his idea of blackness. It wasn't just makeup, it was mimicry. And it didn't age like wine, it curdled like milk. The defenders say, it was the 60s. Everyone did it. Shakespeare intended it. Context matters. The critics say, yes, and this was the context. A time when British prestige meant white men pantomiming the rest of the world. It was art used to reinforce the line between us and them. The camera rolled and the culture flinched. And yet, Olivier's performance is still taught, still quoted, still held aloft in certain circles like a relic immune to time. A perfect example of prestige immunity, where greatness excuses grotesque. But if Othello was a test of empathy, what exactly did Olivier fail? Just behind him, a quieter knight enters stage left. Also powdered, also brown, also miscast. The empire lives on in his performance, and the echoes are loud. 2. Alec Guinness. When Alec Guinness took the role of Professor Godboll in A Passage to India, critics called it a transformative performance. They weren't wrong. He transformed into an elderly Indian Brahmin through makeup, accent, and posture. But that wasn't acting. That was brownface. And not just the theatrical kind, the colonial kind. Guinness, to many, was the face of old-world dignity. Obi-Wan Kenobi in space, George Smiley on Earth. A man whose silences were louder than most people's monologues. But in David Lean's 1984 epic, he wasn't silent. He was sacred. Or at least, he played sacred. The problem? The casting wasn't spiritual. It was logistical. In an India teeming with brilliant actors, why hire a British white man to play a Hindu holy man? The answer was as predictable as it was damning. Star power. In other words, marketing trumped meaning. A familiar face in unfamiliar skin. It wasn't new. It was normal. And that's what makes it worse. Even Guinness himself expressed discomfort with the film later on. Not moral discomfort, but performance dissatisfaction. The question he never asked publicly, should he have taken the role at all? Maybe because that wasn't a question actors of his stature had to consider. The ethical weight of representation wasn't a casting concern. It was someone else's problem. Usually someone not in the room. The legacy of that role is eerie. A movie about colonial misunderstanding. Cast with colonial misunderstanding. A film meant to humanize India that accidentally puppeteered it. And through it all, Guinness stood serene, meditative, unknowable. Like a statue of something once considered wise. Until the pigeons came. And then came the next act. A funnier one. A louder one. A more colorful one. He didn't play Indian with restraint. He went full carnival. He didn't walk into the party. He exploded in through the ceiling. If you're still with us, somewhere between disbelief and déjà vu, now's the time to subscribe for more deep dives into the uncomfortable corners of history. And while the past keeps playing reruns, we want to know about you. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it right now? Are you up late? On your lunch break? Or just passing time with ghosts and grease paint? 3. Peter Sellers. There are comedies that age. There are comedies that rot. The Party, 1968, starring Peter Sellers as Hrundi Vai Bakshi, is the kind that leaves a faint smell no matter how many times you air out the room. Sellers, a man of 1,000 voices and almost as many disguises, built a career on mimicry. He could become anyone, sound like anyone, parody anyone except apparently himself. In The Party, he plays an Indian actor so cartoonish he makes Apu from The Simpsons look like a National Geographic documentary. Sellers donned brown face, slathered on an accent thick enough to chew, and committed. Too hard. The film itself is a chaotic satire, a clumsy outsider disrupting a Hollywood elite party. But the real disruption is off-screen. It's the cognitive dissonance of watching a beloved British icon stumble through stereotypes like they're banana peels. Every thank you please lands like a slap. Every pratfall feels less funny, more diagnostic. What's worse is how warmly it was received at the time. Critics praised Sellers' versatility, calling it delightful and harmless fun. Today, it's harder to laugh without wincing. Watching Sellers' Bakshi is like watching a man juggle dynamite and not realize the fuse is lit. Sellers himself was no stranger to controversy, but here he wasn't playing a villain. He was the punchline and the lens. In interviews, he deflected with charm. He claimed love for the character. But love doesn't excuse imitation, and adoration doesn't erase appropriation. The legacy? A film that's now cited more in apology than in admiration. And yet, it still circulates, still airs, still plays at retrospectives with a sheepish grin. And in the background, a quieter figure chuckles. He's not in a party. He's in a war zone of jokes and jabs. And he helped invent the script. 4. Spike Milligan. Spike Milligan was the kind of comic mind that detonated traditional British humor and replaced it with something weirder, wilder, and much more unstable. He was a surrealist in a straitjacket world, loud, unpredictable, and allergic to consistency. But buried in the chaos of his comedy was a pattern, a punchline that always seemed to punch down. Milligan, like many of his contemporaries, danced on the edge of racial caricature, but in his case, the dance occasionally turned into a full routine. During his time associated with Till Death Us Do Part, a show that blurred satire with sincerity so thoroughly no one was quite sure who the joke was on, Milligan reportedly took part in content that leaned heavily into blackface tropes, not just once, not as a misfire, as part of the era's default setting for edgy comedy. Of course, he claimed it was all irony, that he was mocking racism, not participating in it. And to some extent, that's what the show tried to do, create a character so repellent in his prejudice that the audience would recoil. But satire is a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. And when the makeup goes on, and the laugh track follows, the line starts to smear. Milligan's defenders say he was ahead of his time, a troubled genius lashing out at everything. His critics say he was a relic of empire, wearing its mask and calling it art. The truth, predictably, lives in the uncomfortable middle. A man both questioning and replicating the stereotypes he claimed to mock. And then there's the legacy, still cited as a pioneer, still aired, albeit carefully. But now his comedy comes with a warning label, one he never imagined needing. The next man didn't need labels. He was the label, the face of British slapstick, smiling, winking, and stumbling straight into something far darker. 5. Benny Hill. If you were near a television in Britain during the 70s and 80s, chances are Benny Hill was already there, grinning like he'd just heard a joke that wasn't quite legal. His show was a fever dream of leering glances, speeding soundtracks, and punchlines that usually involved someone being chased, groped, or humiliated. But tucked inside the slapstick and innuendo was something far less innocent: blackface. Not once, not twice, but folded into the fabric of the Benny Hill brand. Sketches surfaced, some long forgotten, others inconveniently remembered, featuring actors in exaggerated makeup, accents, and stereotypes that had already expired decades earlier. And yet, there he was, playing it for laughs. Audiences howled. Networks kept airing it. Merchandising followed. Because back then, comedy didn't have a conscience. It had ratings. Hill wasn't just a comedian. He was a factory, cranking out sketches like sausages, each one squeezed through the same mold, fast, cheap, and borderline offensive. The show was exported worldwide, and with it, so was the version of British humor that proudly mistook mockery for mischief. In his defense, people point to the era. It was different then, they say, as if difference justifies damage. But the thing about time is, it doesn't actually erase anything. It just buries it deeper. Until someone starts digging. Benny Hill died just as the culture started turning, before retrospectives could pin him down, before apology tours were expected. And so his legacy exists in a kind of purgatory, beloved, buried, but still smirking in reruns. Waiting in the wings is a man who wasn't smirking. He was impersonating a president, in full costume, on national television. The joke didn't land, but it never really had to. 6. Harry Enfield. Harry Enfield built an empire on impersonation. British TV in the 90s was his playground, and everyone was fair game. Politicians, working-class dads, clueless teenagers, they all became masks for Enfield to wear, voices for him to parody. But somewhere in that rotating cast of characters, he put on one too many. One of his most notorious moments came when he performed a sketch impersonating Nelson Mandela. Not the man's ideas, not his voice, the man himself. Visually, physically, and yes, racially. The makeup, the accent, the caricature, it was all there. And for reasons still unclear, no one in the studio stopped him. The logic at the time was comedy carte blanche, that nothing should be off limits. That intention matters more than impact. But the audience had changed. The laughter had turned awkward. And the line Enfield crossed wasn't blurry. It was visible from space. In later years, Enfield didn't deny it. He contextualized it, said it was satire, said the show was trying to lampoon ignorance. But satire has a rule: punch up, not down. And if the audience can't tell who the butt of the joke is, chances are, it's the wrong person. The Mandela sketch wasn't an isolated moment. Retrospectives would later highlight a pattern, a comedy of impersonation that often drifted into impersonation of race, with co-stars, with costumes, with scripts that, in hindsight, feel like accident reports. And yet, Enfield remains a respected figure, still working, still funny, still invited to the table. That's the thing about British comedy. When it trips, it gets up with a shrug. But someone was standing next to him during those years, laughing, acting, sometimes blacking up in tandem. Because racism, like comedy, is often a double act. 7. Paul Whitehouse. Paul Whitehouse has always played the quiet one, the observer, the comic who slips in sideways, lets the louder personalities take the heat while he gently sharpens the knife. To the public, he's the soulful half of British sketch comedy, melancholy, absurd, human. A man who could make a single sigh feel like a punchline, which is why his involvement in blackface-related sketches alongside Harry Enfield lands with such an odd thud. Whitehouse wasn't the face on the poster. He wasn't delivering the most aggressive lines. But he was there. In the room, in the makeup chair, in sketches that leaned on racial impersonation as shorthand comedy, not critique. Retrospectives later tried to soften it. Context, irony, intention. But intention doesn't survive reruns. What survives is the image. The defense often goes like this. Whitehouse was supporting satire, not racism. The characters were exaggerated fools. The joke was ignorance itself. And sometimes, yes, that was the aim. But satire is fragile. If it isn't crystal clear who's being mocked, it collapses into participation. And once the laugh track rolls, the damage is already framed as entertainment. What makes Whitehouse's case more unsettling is his later work. His characters grew more tender, more introspective. Men broken by modern life. Souls adrift in post-industrial Britain. It's as if he evolved while the archive stayed frozen. Old sketches resurfacing like ghosts that don't recognize the man he became. That dissonance is the story here. Not a villain, not a monster. Just a reminder that complicity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it shrugs. Sometimes it smiles politely and says nothing while the joke sails past the line. And somewhere else on British television, a different kind of character was being born. One with a painted smile, a rope around his neck, and an accent that turned dread into comedy. He didn't just unsettle viewers, he got entire episodes pulled. 8. Mark Gatiss. Papa Lazarou didn't arrive quietly. He burst onto the screen in The League of Gentlemen like a nightmare that learned how to knock. Bald head, blackened face, painted grin stretched too wide to trust. He spoke in a warped sing-song voice and carried himself like a children's entertainer who'd seen too much. Mark Gatiss helped create him. At the time, the character was defended as horror comedy, a deliberate collision of minstrel imagery with psychological terror. The argument was that Papa Lazarou wasn't a joke about race, but a joke about fear itself. A monster assembled from Britain's cultural rot. And for years that explanation stuck. Until it didn't. In 2020, platforms quietly pulled episodes featuring the character. Not with fanfare, not with condemnation. Just a soft digital erasure. Suddenly, the satire defense felt thinner. Because if the joke truly dismantled racism, why did it require blackface to function? Why did the imagery echo so cleanly with a history everyone claimed to be mocking? Gatiss later acknowledged the discomfort. He didn't deny the impact. He admitted that the character wouldn't be made today, which is a careful sentence. It doesn't say it was wrong, just expired. Papa Lazarou remains a cultural scar. Brilliant to some, indefensible to others. And Gatiss remains a respected writer, actor, and commentator on British culture. The contradiction sits there, unresolved. A man capable of nuance who once leaned on the bluntest visual language available. But Gatiss didn't build that world alone. He wasn't the only one behind the makeup. Two other men shared the pen, the stage, and the fallout. And one of them specialized in turning discomfort into something far more intimate. 9. Steve Pemberton. Steve Pemberton's comedy has always lived in close quarters. Small rooms, tight frames, emotional claustrophobia. Where other comedians go broad, Pemberton goes inward. His characters don't scream, they simmer. They rot slowly, politely, until the audience realizes they've been complicit in watching something deeply wrong, which makes his involvement in the League of Gentlemen controversy feel almost inevitable. Pemberton co-created a show obsessed with outsiders, grotesques, and moral decay. The village of Royston Vasey wasn't meant to be welcoming. It was meant to reflect the ugliest corners of insular Britain. And Papa Lazarou, the most infamous creation, fit that mission perfectly. Except for one problem. The imagery didn't just reflect ugliness. It replicated it. When episodes were pulled years later, the response was defensive fatigue. Pemberton, like his collaborators, leaned on context, horror, satire, intent. But audiences weren't arguing intent anymore. They were talking about impact, about how certain images carry too much history to be neutral, no matter how clever the writing around them is. What complicates Pemberton's case is his later work, Inside Number 9, a masterclass in moral ambiguity. Stories that dissect cruelty rather than celebrate it. Tales where the punchline is often shame. It's as if he learned, refined, sharpened. And yet, the early work remains, unchanged and uncomfortable. That's the tension at the heart of British comedy history. Growth without erasure. Accountability without consensus. Pemberton isn't condemned, but he isn't absolved either. He exists in the gray space where talent and blindness overlap. And he wasn't alone in that space. Another collaborator stands beside him, one who leaned even harder into the grotesque, and whose face is just as tied to the character people still argue about. The trio isn't finished yet. 10. Reece Shearsmith. Reece Shearsmith might be the most chameleonic of the League of Gentlemen trio, disappearing into wigs, accents, and affectations like someone trying to outrun their own reflection. His comedy is meticulous. Too meticulous, maybe. Every gesture calculated, every line steeped in a kind of weaponized awkwardness. He doesn't play characters, he performs dissection. And yet, with all that precision, Papa Lazarou still made it to air. Shearsmith donned the blackface makeup for the role, playing a character so racially loaded that entire episodes were later pulled without ceremony. The makeup wasn't subtle, it wasn't stylized, it wasn't obscured by satire, it was overt, grinning, and unforgettable. And it came from three men who absolutely knew how disturbing it looked. That was the point, they claimed. But satire without distance becomes imitation, especially when you put the joke in makeup and then write the horror around it. Papa Lazarou wasn't a spontaneous mistake. He was crafted, rehearsed, broadcast, and applauded. Until the applause stopped. Shearsmith, to his credit, has been more circumspect than some of his peers. Less defiant, more resigned. He hasn't mounted a full defense of the character, but he also hasn't disowned it. Like much of British comedy's troubled archive, the assumption is that the work now speaks for itself, mostly in whispers. And it does whisper. About how a character like Lazarou could only exist in a culture fluent in looking away. About how horror and comedy become the same thing when the audience isn't sure what they're laughing at. Shearsmith went on to co-create Inside Number 9, a show so layered with ethical ambiguity it sometimes feels like an apology dressed as a ghost story. But the ghost of Lazarou still knocks. Not that he's the only one still knocking, because while the comedians were painting their faces, another man was taking the stage with no makeup needed, just a mic, a spotlight, and a sneer. 11. Jim Davidson. Jim Davidson didn't wear blackface. He didn't need to. His material was already wearing it. Davidson came up through the working men's clubs of Britain, venues where comedy wasn't a performance, it was survival. Say something offensive, fast and loud. Get the laugh before someone throws a pint glass. But Davidson didn't just survive that culture, he became its mascot. His stand-up routines, particularly in the 80s and 90s, trafficked openly in racial stereotypes. Black voices, Pakistani accents, jokes about immigration, cultural tropes, all delivered with the swagger of someone who didn't care if you winced. If you were offended, you were the problem. If you didn't laugh, you didn't get it. And if you tried to call it out, well, you were clearly part of the woke brigade before that even had a name. He wasn't hiding it, he was selling it. What makes Davidson's case especially potent is that he wasn't just some fringe comic shouting into a void. He was a BBC mainstay, host of Big Break, host of The Generation Game, a primetime personality who somehow coexisted with an aggressively off-color stand-up act. A man who could smile on Saturday night television and then tour with a set that could peel paint off the walls. Over time, the culture caught up, or rather, overtook him. Gigs were canceled, protests mounted. Davidson went from national figure to national argument. He claimed censorship. His critics called it accountability. And his defenders? They just called it old school. Jim Davidson never apologized, not really. Because for him, the past wasn't a mistake. It was a brand. And brands don't change. They just fade until someone nostalgic comes looking. But Davidson was just the symptom. The next man was the system. He didn't sneak offensive jokes past the crowd. He made the crowd part of the act. And the laughter this time was colder. 12. Bernard Manning. Bernard Manning didn't tell jokes. He detonated them. Standing on stage in a dinner jacket that looked like it had survived a nuclear incident, Manning's delivery was aggressive, fast, and soaked in the smog of post-war pub culture. He wasn't performing for approval. He was daring the audience to object, and most didn't. His act was stuffed to the gills with racism. Not coded, not veiled, not ironic, straight-up industrial-grade racial mockery, black jokes, Asian jokes, Jewish jokes, delivered with a knowing smirk and the full expectation that you'd either laugh or leave. And the thing is, people laughed. For decades. His club, the notorious Embassy Club in Manchester, was packed with loyalists. Working-class men and women who didn't want nuance, didn't want politics, didn't want progress. They wanted Bernard. And Bernard delivered. He claimed it was all in good fun, that everyone was fair game. But that's the problem with equal opportunity offense. It pretends that power dynamics don't exist. That mocking the marginalized is the same as mocking the powerful. Manning's comedy wasn't punching up. It wasn't even punching down. It was kicking, repeatedly, and then asking why the floor was bleeding. Manning had defenders in high places, some comedians, some politicians. Even after his death, he was framed as a misunderstood figure. A man of his time. A provocateur. But that only works if you believe times are absolution. They're not. And Manning, like Davidson, didn't fade because he apologized. He faded because the audience changed. But not all audiences did. In certain corners, the laughter kept going, louder, cruder. And one particular man took up the mantle, louder than both of them. A comic in a leather jacket, swearing through a cigarette, asking if free speech was dead while stomping on its grave. 13. Roy Chubby Brown. Roy Chubby Brown isn't a stage name. It's a warning label. Dressed in a patchwork suit, flying goggles, and a voice like a bulldog gargling sandpaper, he's the embodiment of everything people either miss or regret about 20th century British comedy. His shows don't flirt with offense. They propose to it, repeatedly, in public. Unlike Bernard Manning or Jim Davidson, who at least tried to maintain some dual identity, TV host by day, insult comic by night, Roy Chubby Brown never pretended. His act is explicit, abrasive, and in many cases, banned. Entire regions have refused to host him. His shows have been pulled from venues not because he said something outrageous, but because that's the whole show. His racist content is well documented, mocking Black, Asian, Muslim communities with the kind of glee that turns cruelty into currency. He's not satirizing prejudice, he's weaponizing it. And the audience? Often delighted. They don't want nuance. They want permission. And Brown delivers it like a slap with a Union Jack. What's curious is how long the act lasted. Through the 2000s, through protests, through evolving media standards, Brown still packed out theaters, still sold DVDs, Still delivered the same set with minor updates, maybe a new target, maybe a new headline to twist. But the joke underneath never changed. It was always, "You can't say anything anymore, except I just did." Defenders call him a champion of free speech. Detractors call him a fossilized hate machine. Both are right, because Roy Chubby Brown isn't here to be understood. He's here to survive defiantly in the underbelly of nostalgia. But sometimes the line between hate and humor gets blurred by irony, especially when it's delivered by people who later claim they meant the exact opposite. One such man wore blackface on 90s TV, and now writes about anti-Semitism on Twitter. 14. David Baddiel. David Baddiel built a reputation as a clever man in dumb sketches. In the 1990s, he was part of a comedy duo, Baddiel and Skinner, that delivered football songs and late-night TV like a pair of lads who had just discovered irony in a pub bathroom. But buried among the banter was a character that didn't age well. At all. Jason Lee. That was the name. A footballer with dreadlocks in an unfortunate place in Baddiel's repertoire. The impersonation involved a pineapple wig, a flattened accent, and, you guessed it, blackface. For years it was recurring. A sketchbook go-to. The joke wasn't just the voice or the hair, it was the entire person, reduced to costume, punchline, and a kind of racially coded ridicule that only seems harmless if you've never been the target. Jason Lee has since spoken about it. About the damage, the abuse, the long tale of schoolyard mockery amplified by national TV. Baddiel, to his credit, eventually apologized. Not immediately, not when the show was airing, but decades later, when the apology was less a revelation and more a necessity. And here's the rub. Baddiel has become one of the UK's most vocal commentators on racism, specifically anti-Semitism. He wrote a book, appeared on panels, demanded nuance from others. And he's not wrong. His critiques are sharp, often needed, but they come with baggage he packed himself. Can someone evolve? Of course. Should they be allowed to speak on racism after perpetrating it? Maybe. But not without acknowledgement, and not without the uncomfortable irony of a man who once wore blackface now explaining racism to audiences like it's a TED Talk. And he wasn't the only Python-adjacent comic to slap on the makeup and call it comedy. The next man brought surrealism, sketches, and a very real stain that history hasn't quite washed out. 15. Graham Chapman. Graham Chapman was the absurdist philosopher of Monty Python, half academic, half anarchist. He played kings and lunatics with the same wild-eyed detachment, delivering lines that felt like they had stumbled out of a dream and landed on the wrong continent. He was witty. He was strange. He was undeniably brilliant. And he wore blackface on national television. It was a sketch, a joke, a character. That's what they all say. The Pythons were masters of meta-comedy, poking fun at stereotypes, roles, and authority. But in at least one instance, blackface was part of the punchline, not deconstructed, not critiqued, just used. As if the act itself wasn't the point, as if audiences would simply understand the irony. But irony, as we know, ages like milk. Chapman, like his Python peers, existed in a time when white British comedians could treat race like a costume change. And because they were clever, too clever sometimes, they often got away with it. They weren't the Jim Davidsons of the world. They weren't sneering. They were intellectuals. So when the sketches hit a nerve, defenders swarmed to explain the layers. You don't get it. It's satire. It's about colonialism. But the image remained, the makeup stayed, and no footnote ever erased the visual. Chapman died young, canonized as a comedy saint. Tributes flowed, reverence followed, and no one really wanted to talk about the sketch, about that scene, about how even geniuses trip on the same lazy shorthand as the worst of them. Still, the legacy lingers. Even in the weird, the progressive, the surreal, there's always a crack where the old world seeps in. And in the next case, that crack wasn't in the sketch, it was the sketch. A TV moment so surreal it's practically erased. But the tape still exists. 16. Judy Carne. Judy Carne was best known as the "Sock It to Me" girl on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, a glittery variety show that turned counterculture into primetime chaos. She was British, blonde, and bouncy, shipped to American screens like a cheeky cultural import. But between the sketches and slapstick, there was a moment that now lives in quiet infamy. It was 1969. Carne appeared in a sketch wearing blackface. A brief moment, a throwaway gag. The kind of thing that, at the time, passed with little fanfare and no protest. Just another beat in a show built on speed and absurdity. But the image, her face darkened, her expressions exaggerated, doesn't read as just comedy anymore. It reads as something else entirely. A flashpoint frozen in celluloid, testifying to how mainstream racism was coded as variety. Unlike many on this list, Carne wasn't a writer. She wasn't shaping the content. She was performing it, following the cues, saying the lines. So does that absolve her? Not really. Because part of the machinery is being willing to stand in front of it and smile. In her later life, Carne faded from public view, haunted more by personal demons than public reckonings. The blackface incident is rarely mentioned in retrospectives, almost like it's been edited out of her legacy. But history has a strange sense of recall. It remembers what was once convenient to forget, and convenience plays a big role in the next case. A man who, like Carne, once blacked up on TV, but unlike her, carried the swagger of a rock legend while doing it. Because what's a little racism if the guitar solo shreds? 17. Roger Daltrey. Roger Daltrey, lead singer of The Who, wasn't exactly known for subtlety. He smashed microphones, roared through anthems, and turned rebellion into a performance art. But there's one performance in his resume that tends to get lost, buried under the decibels and denim. In a 1970s TV sketch, Daltrey appeared in blackface. No fanfare, no satire, just part of the joke. A brief scene, a laugh, and a cultural relic now sealed in digital embarrassment. It wasn't a solo act. He was one of several celebrities who partook in the era's casual racism as comedy buffet. But Daltrey's participation stands out because of who he was. A rock icon, not a sketch comic. A supposed rebel, miming an old colonial trope. The dissonance is hard to ignore. This was the man who belted out "Won't Get Fooled Again" like a generational battle cry, only to later paint his face for a punchline so tired it collapsed decades ago. It's less rebellion, more regression. Less youthful rage, more uncle at a costume party energy. Did he ever address it? Not really. Like most moments of cultural cringe from the 70s, it was allowed to evaporate. No apology tour, no archival remorse. Just silence, followed by more albums. But images don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. They get shared, discussed, reframed. And in that reframing, the myth of Daltrey the Defiant starts to crack. Because rebellion without reflection isn't bravery, it's branding. And speaking of branding, the next act didn't just cross a line. They made a primetime game show out of it. With glitter, laughter, and a pair of blacked-up hosts who were, quite literally, the face of British weekend TV. 18. Aunt McPartlin. Aunt McPartlin, one half of Britain's most beloved presenting duo, was once the cheeky face of Saturday night. Alongside Declan Donnelly, he helmed Saturday Night Takeaway, Britain's Got Talent, and an entire subgenre of TV that thrived on chaos, charm, and carefully scripted mischief. But back in 2003, Aunt also stepped into something else: blackface. In a sketch meant to parody Jamaican TV hosts, Aunt darkened his skin, donned dreadlocks, and leaned into the accent. It aired as comedy. No warning, no irony. Just another part of the Takeaways variety toolkit. Celebrity impressions, cross-dressing gags, and racist costume. Years later, the clip resurfaced, and it didn't look nostalgic. It looked radioactive. In 2020, amid a wave of accountability, ITV pulled multiple episodes of the show from their streaming platforms. Ant and Dec issued a formal apology. They acknowledged that the sketches were wrong, that they wouldn't be made today. That times had changed. But had they? Or had the cameras simply caught up? What made the moment sting wasn't just the act. It was who did it. Ant wasn't an aging comic from another era. He was a current host, still adored, still trusted. A man whose entire career was built on approachability. And yet when the sketch aired, no one seemed to blink. That's the quieter part of the problem. Not the outrage, but the absence of it. The years when no one saw anything wrong. When the laughter rolled on, uninterrupted, and the laughter didn't stop there. Because Dec was standing right next to him. Same sketch, same makeup, same silence. A double act, united in charm, and in controversy. 19. Declan Donnelly. Declan Donnelly, the other half of the Ant and Dec empire, has always worn the smile of a man who knows exactly when to nod, when to joke, and when to disappear into a punchline. He's the smoother one, the safer one. Less mischief, more polish. But back in 2003, polish gave way to parody, and not the kind that ages gracefully. In the same Saturday Night Takeaway sketch where Ant appeared in blackface, Dec was right beside him, equally made up, equally complicit. Together they impersonated fictional Caribbean hosts Pat and Lee, complete with dreadlocks, brown face, and forced accents. It was pitched as lighthearted, a quick character bit, something supposedly all in fun. There was no satire, no commentary, just racial impersonation as entertainment. What makes it worse, if such a thing is needed, is that this wasn't buried in some forgotten pilot. It aired on one of Britain's most watched shows, in prime time, in the 21st century. It wasn't underground. It was endorsed, produced, applauded, and then promptly forgotten, until it wasn't. In 2020, as a cultural reckoning swept through global entertainment, the sketch re-emerged. Donnelly and McPartlin issued an apology stating they were sincerely sorry, that it was wrong then and it's wrong now. But apologies can't reverse tape, and the clip, once rewatched, speaks volumes louder than the carefully worded regret. Donnelly's public image remains largely intact. That's the quiet magic of likability. It dulls outrage, but it also masks patterns. Because Donnelly wasn't a lone misfire. He was part of a legacy, a continuum of performers who made spectacle out of stereotype, laughter out of legacy. And speaking of legacies, the next man didn't just perform in blackface. He built an entire musical career inside it, singing, smiling, and dancing beneath a coat of denial that spanned decades. 20. John Boulter. John Boulter wasn't a household name, but his face, or more accurately, his painted face, was beamed into millions of homes every week. As one of the lead singers of the black and white minstrel show, Boulter didn't just dabble in blackface, he lived in it. With full commitment, operatic vocals, and the kind of earnestness that made the whole thing even more chilling. The show ran from 1958 to 1978. Making it one of the BBC's most bafflingly long-lived cultural artifacts. A variety program where white performers sang traditional tunes and show tunes while wearing blackface. The entire premise was built on plantation-era mimicry, stylized minstrel imagery, and the deeply uncomfortable combination of upbeat music and racial caricature. Boulter, with his golden tenor voice and clean-cut stage presence, became a recurring centerpiece. He wasn't a clown. He was presented as dignified, respectable, standing center stage, pitch perfect, and covered in makeup that told an entirely different story. It was blackface dressed in tuxedos, minstrelsy made palatable for Sunday night. In later years, Boulter never issued a public apology. Why would he? The show had been framed as harmless, nostalgic, even charming. It won awards. It had royal fans. It was only as the decades passed that the full grotesqueness of the act became undeniable. But denial is the point. Because for a long time, the show told Britain exactly what it wanted to hear, that racism could be showbiz, that history could be rewritten in harmonies, that blackface could be sanitized with choreography and strings. And if John Boulter was the singer, then the next man was the soul of it. The star voice, the smooth baritone that lulled a nation into ignoring what it was really applauding. 21. Dai Francis. Dai Francis wasn't just a performer on the black and white minstrel show. He was its leading man, the voice that audiences associated with class, tradition, and a warped idea of musical heritage. Francis, a Welsh singer with remarkable vocal range, stood center stage night after night, wearing the same blackface makeup as his co-stars, serenading viewers through a lens of false nostalgia. His presence wasn't comedic, it was sincere. That's what made it more insidious. Francis sang with pathos, with charm, with theatrical dignity. He brought the illusion of depth to performances that, at their core, were built on a lie, that this form of entertainment was harmless, that it had no roots in exploitation, that it was simply fun. But the black and white minstrel show wasn't a strange little footnote in British history. It was prime-time television, funded by public money, winning national awards, and Dai Francis was its figurehead. The smiling proof that tradition could justify almost anything, so long as it had a good voice and a nice suit. In interviews, Francis reportedly insisted that the show wasn't racist, that it had nothing to do with race. And therein lies the final twist. When racism becomes decorum, when it's dressed in musical notes and Victorian pomp, it becomes invisible to those performing it, but not to those watching. The show eventually ended, not with scandal, with exhaustion, with history catching up. But the image of Francis, face painted, voice soaring, remains one of the most surreal contradictions in British entertainment. A symbol of how the country sang its way through denial. And when the curtain finally fell, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like an admission. One that came too late for an apology and far too early for forgetting.